Hi everyone, Cindy Turner here, creator of Evolving Women, and today I have the lovely Mel MacDonald with me. Mel is an amazing woman I've met recently, and she started her life as a chemistry graduate, and after a few years of managing laboratories and renovating investment properties, she took the leap into buying, renovating, and selling businesses instead. She has owned a couple of restaurants, an engineering business, a resort, and we'll talk more about that a bit later, a portfolio of commercial and residential properties, and a couple of private colleges, including one which she and her team got into the BRW Fast 100, and another which they successfully sold to a publicly listed company in the middle of the global financial crisis. She has won several business awards, been on various boards and government advisory councils. She's written her first book, and her second book is soon to be released. And she speaks around the world about business growth. Welcome, Mel.
Thank you.
Gosh, that just sounds like an incredible background. You've got such a diverse range of experience in business. So absolutely a privilege to have you here today, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation around.
Yeah, me too.
Around losing your first $10 million and the lessons you've learned through that.
Yeah, that wasn't on that list, I don't think, was it?
No, but obviously a great experience to, a phenomenal experience to have to go through, and, the learnings that you would take from that. So this conversation I wanted to have today is around that journey for you and sharing some of that wisdom that you've gained through that time. So lovely to have you here today. So, without further ado, with all that amazing background, I want to cast you back to 2011 when you were probably, I dare say, at the height of your career. You're feeling really confident and positive. Maybe take us back to that time of where you were at and how you were feeling at that point before making a monumental decision in your career.
Yeah, sure. That's an interesting one. I think I was feeling pretty bulletproof at the time, which is interesting because I'd spent a reasonable chunk of my career dealing with all those things that I think women tend to deal with more than men, things like that, in terms of like the whole imposter syndrome thing. So, when I first started in my corporate career and I was fairly successful, fairly young, I spent a lot of time thinking, what happens when they find out that I don't know what I'm doing? And then the same, you go into business and you go, wow, people want to buy things from me. Well, okay, I must be saying the right thing. But you have this kind of deep down thing of like, maybe you don't really know anything after all. And funnily enough, I'd probably got to the point where I was like, yeah, I know everything. So I'd kind of gone from being afraid I was an imposter to being like, yeah, everything I touch turns to gold, and I'm so good at this.
Yeah, okay. So you're feeling like really probably at the height of your career, you're feeling bulletproof, unstoppable, like everything you're touching seems to be going really well, and you're obviously conveying your ideas and thoughts really effectively because people were buying into those, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So in 2011, you made this massive decision to buy a resort. Tell us a bit about that.
So since then I've actually discovered the word hubris, and I know what that means now. I hadn't actually heard of that word before. But so I decided almost impulsively, actually, which is kind of alarming. I've always been, I guess, a bit of an opportunist in business, in the sense that if I see a really interesting opportunity, then I've always been quite proud of the fact that I'm someone who will act quite quickly and take it up. And I think there's a difference between that and chasing bright, shiny objects. Like, I think a lot of people jump from one thing to the next because they go, oh, I should do this, or I should try this, or but I think I was always quite good at being quite linear about it, but keeping my eyes on the horizon to go, what's the next step, what's the next leap, what's the next thing I should do. And anyway, by beginning of 2011, end of 2010, I think it was when we had the floods in Brisbane. The business that I was running was going really well. We'd won some awards. We were making good profits. I think that the previous year we'd cleared, I don't know, in terms of profit, it was quite a bit over $1 million, which for a little company was quite good. Mm-hmm. Like that was, profit after everything. And I was actually at a lunch and talking to a guy, and he said, and this was in the middle of the floods, that's right. And he said, and the floods are relevant because he said, look, there's this resort for sale in Noosa, which is in receivership. And because of the floods, there's been some issues with the marketing of it, and the tender's closed tomorrow afternoon. And, I have it on good authority that they haven't even got any offers. And because I don't think anyone was in the mood for buying resorts in the middle of, the whole city being washed away. And so I looked into it in, the 24 hours that I had, and made a really fast, ridiculous offer, as I saw it, ridiculously low compared to what the valuation was. And a few weeks later, found myself the owner of a resort.
And knowing full well that that business was losing how much per year?
At least $1 million a year. I mean, they wouldn't give us the figures because it was a receivership, but just on the face of it, you're looking at spending about $9 million to buy something that's probably losing about $1 million a year. But hey, I've got superpowers, I can fix that.
Absolutely. So you're feeling like uber confident buying this business that you made a very quick decision around because of time pressures.
Yeah.
Knowing full well that it was losing money every year.
And it's not like any successful business person before has ever bought a resort or an island or something and had it go bad,
Yeah. Okay, so on reflection now, though, thinking about that time in your life, obviously this was a fairly risky decision, but you had this confidence that you could turn it around, right the business.
Yeah. And I guess on reflection, one of the things that I've discovered, and I'm probably jumping ahead, I won't go too far, is that it's often not the first bad decision that gets you, it's the decisions that you make after the first one, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So even having made what on the face of it was, I mean, on the other side of it, you could say, well, we were buying it for a third of what it was valued at. So that seems like a pretty good deal. And in hindsight, there were some things that could have worked, if we just basically bought it, because we got the real estate. So we ended up with, 30 something apartments in this deal. Just sold each apartment individually and recovered some money and made a profit and gone home. Then that would have been fine. But I think when ego starts getting involved and when part of your identity then becomes, oh, I own a resort, then that changes things, shall I say.
Bit blurred, yeah. So I believe now you've decided to you've got a bit of a passion project around interviewing other people that are in a similar situation to where you were at in 2011. Yeah. And you're writing a book around this, yeah?
Yeah, so what happened with this is that it all went bad, and I'll spare you the boring details, but it all went bad, and I lost all the money I put into the resort plus quite a bit more. And so when something like that happens, and especially when you're someone who believes that you're actually intelligent and good at what you do and all those sorts of things, it's actually, there's a whole lot of psychology that happens. The finance is only probably 10% of it, and the emotion is probably 90%. And there were a lot of other things happening in my life at the time. My husband was really ill. There's a bunch of personal stuff. So it was a horrible year. And we're talking, when did it all go wrong? Probably 2016, 17, around then. So, a little while ago now. And so I did what all good, competent business people do and stuff like that. And I basically just went to bed and put a blanket over my head when I'm not doing
go away.
And it's interesting because I have a much better understanding now of, like a lot of the time when people are in bad situations, you kind of go, well, why don't they just do this? Or why don't they just, there's a lot of sentences that start with, why don't they just? And yeah, I had never been in a position before where just having the energy to get out of bed and get through the day was enough of a challenge, let alone running around fixing things. So it was a real lesson for me, actually, in terms of empathy for people, I guess, where I've been kind of impatient of why don't they just sort themselves out?
Yeah. And it probably would be easy for someone outside looking in to sort of say, well, snap out of it, move on, get going.
Yeah.
When you're in that, and I think you found through your research for your book that there's actually some psychology around what was going on for you and for others in this this type of situation.
Yeah, and the book was almost an accident. Like, I had done a book before, which is out of print now, called The Capitalist Hippie, which was basically about, you know, how to make money and keep your values, that sort of thing. And that had been quite successful. I love writing and I love talking to people. And so in this, you know, this period of time where I was not really wanting to get out of bed, I started, funnily enough, thanks to Facebook, I was in some business Facebook group, and I hopped in there and said, this has just happened. And, you know, and it was a group of strangers. And I guess I felt that I could share that with a group of strangers more easily because the anonymity that goes with it. Yeah. And anyway, one guy in that group reached out to me and said, hey, I had a similar thing happen. I lost, like, I don't know, I think it was $11 million in the GFC, and this is where I'm at now. And he wrote me a really thoughtful private message, which was just, you know, along the lines of, yes, you sound like there's lots of bravado there, but I actually can tell where you'll be right now. This is where, you know, you're probably thinking this, this, and this. You're probably feeling this. And it was like, oh, wow, someone who gets me. I didn't realize that anyone else had been on this journey. And then a friend of mine who I had confided in, who's in finance, had a client, and she said, look, I've got a client who lost about $70 million and was all over the front pages of the newspapers while he was doing it. He's willing to have a chat to you if you like. And I started just finding people who had been there before. And by being there before, I mean people who had done something. And sometimes they didn't think they'd done anything. Sometimes they thought it was the external environment, but that's ended up becoming part of my research, was what do people attribute this to? But I started finding people who had lost, you know, 10 or tens of millions of dollars, crashed and burned, and then started researching, well, what happened? How did they get there? What did they do? How did they recover? Where are they now? And and initially it wasn't about how can I help people with this, you know, what's useful in here that are the takeaway lessons. Initially it was very much just a therapy project for me. It was like, I need to talk to these people and make my little support group of, you know, other idiots. And then it just grew into a project, and I started setting criteria for people and finding people and interviewing them. Then I thought, well, who's researched this? Someone must have done some formal, and some of these guys, and it was interesting, they're all men actually. As one of them said to me, women don't usually do big stupid things, which I'm not sure how to take that. And one of them said, look, you need to get the science behind this, not just the anecdotal stuff. And so I went looking for people who had researched entrepreneurial failure, I guess, as a category. Found someone in Sweden who'd actually taken 1,000 businesses that had collapsed and interviewed all the founders and done a whole lot of quantitative research. Started thinking I was going to have to go to Sweden, then went searching for her, and turns out that she's working now at one of the universities here in Brisbane.
Fantastic.
So that was great. So I've been picking her brains a lot, and she's given me a lot of the theoretical underpinning of the stuff that I'd been finding in my, I guess, anecdotal interview type research.
So what was some of the research? You've talked to me about this Nobel Prize winning research around failure and some of the learnings that you gained from that. Would you like to share that?
Yeah, so this was really interesting. So one of the guys that I spoke to was the first person to kind of bring this to my attention. And he said it wasn't the first decision that he made, but it was the second and third ones that made it worse. And then I started asking other people, was that the same? Could they pin their collapse, if you like, down to one single decision, or was it a sequence of things? And they almost all said, no, it was 2 or 3. They did something, and then they did something else that made it worse, and then something else that made it terminal.
Right.
And I was intrigued by that, and I was wondering what it is about us that makes us do that. And then when I was talking to Anna Jenkins, she's the researcher in this stuff, I was asking her about it, and said in her research of her 1,000 people, had she discovered anything like that? And she got, you know, quite excited about it. She said, oh, that's prospect theory, which I hadn't heard of. So prospect theory, this is definitely my interpretation of it. This is, you know, forgive me, academics that are listening. But the prospect theory guys got, I think it's one person, he got a Nobel Prize for figuring this out, where he basically started analysing behaviour that people do when they're succeeding, if you like, and behaviour that people do when they're failing. And if you Google prospect theory, you'll see a graph that looks like a grid. So it's got 4 lines, and then it's got a sort of a exponential curve here and then a curve going the other way up the other side. What he found is that, and probably the simplest way to explain it, I think they started off doing their research on casinos. So if you're at the casino and you've won $2,000 and then you lose $100, the chances are you're just going to go, oh, well, 1,900 is still pretty nice winnings. I'll take it home and I'll go. Whereas if you're at the casino and you've lost $500 and then you lose another 100, so you're still losing 100, just like you did in the previous example, you're now 600 down and you go, I can't go home when I'm $600 down. I'm going to bet another 600 and try and make my 600 back. And then if you lose that and you're 1,200 down, then you're going to go, 1,200, there's no way I can go home now being 1,200 down. I'm going to have to put a really big bet on to try and make it recover. And occasionally that wins. Occasionally you choose the right card or number or whatever and you get your 1,200 back, but that's pretty rare.
Yeah.
Most of the time, people keep on doubling down on their losses until they run out of resources and then they have to go home because they've got no money.
So it's like a cumulative effect. It's like the decisions keep on getting
worse. Yeah.
The risk taking goes up and the decisions, quality decisions go down.
Exactly. And that were exactly the two things that she was explaining to me, that the risks that you take increase in size and your decision making, like your cognitive ability in terms of decision making, goes down at the same time as your risks are going up, which is a pretty fatal combination, really. And from my research, I'm finding that prospect theory that applies in a casino kind of situation, and I've looked at it in terms of share marketing, investing and things like that, but it also applies very much so in entrepreneurship and things like that, where you make one bad decision and you end up $600 down in the casino, for example, or you end up owning a resort at Noosa. You could probably come back from that. But it's when you double down. And so in our case, when we decided to spend, a couple of $1 million on renovating the resort, when you start doubling down and doing those sorts of things is when you really sort of make things irreparable, I guess. So I found that fascinating because I think that applies to much smaller decisions as well. The other part of it that I think is really interesting is that one of the things I would like to do more research on is that poor decision making, that risk taking, influenced by how many decision makers there are in the process? So, if you're an entrepreneur without a board or without a spouse who's going to have strong opinions about the business, who's engaged in the business, are you more likely to, do the double or quits kind of gamble thing? Whereas I wonder if you've got a whole board that you have to justify your decisions to, I would assume, but I don't know, I want to do some more research on it, that you've got to make better decisions. And then one of the guys that was one of my research subjects said to me the other day that in his perception, that entrepreneurs with a spouse or a business partner, I guess, who's competent and heavily involved in the business, probably are a bit more thoughtful in their decision making as well, which kind of would make sense.
Well, you would think more minds would be better than one in terms of having that sounding board and having different perspectives, hopefully, in your decision making process.
Yeah. So I'm really interested to discover whether that's true or not, because is it just that you have two people making bad decisions together, or what happens? I would assume that more perspectives are going to change it, but I think that whole prospect theory idea put some framework behind what I've been seeing, which is why are people doing stupider and stupider things and the more trouble that they get into.
So the people, Mel, that you're interviewing for your book, are they solopreneurs, or are they people that would have business partners and boards that they would be answerable to?
Most people that I've interviewed, even though they're quite big, like one guy had a $110 million company that collapsed, and he had investors, but not actual other decision makers. So actually, when I think about it, everybody that I've talked to has been the sole or major decision maker.
Yeah.
Which does suggest there's some value perhaps in not centralizing all decision making.
Yeah. And so what are some of the themes that have resulted through your interviews with those people? What are you finding?
Some really interesting things, actually. One of the things that I've found, and that seems to be a common theme, is this question of like, why did you do this thing in the first place? And you know, there are people who talk about, oh, people who get successful and then they sabotage themselves, but I think that's too simplistic, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what it is more that, from what I've seen from my research, is the more we continue to do the thing that we're good at doing. You know, and it's that line that our greatest strength is our greatest weakness. So if we're really good at taking on a challenge and fixing something that's broken, we'll keep looking for challenges to take on and broken things to fix.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't actually think it's got anything to do with self-sabotage. I think it's just to do with the fact that we just keep becoming more and more and more of what we are.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're a problem solver, we just need bigger and bigger problems to solve. You know, if we are a person who manages people, we just want more and more people to manage, whatever it might be.
Right.
So I think that we need to be really aware of what our strengths are and go, at what point does this strength stop being a strength?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
what we need to balance it out. The other thing that I have seen that has killed a few entrepreneurs, in the metaphorical sense, hopefully, is boredom, which is kind of related to that. So I think a lot of the entrepreneurs that have got themselves in trouble, it's interesting actually, a lot of them are fairly intelligent,
Yeah.
or actually very intelligent, and have got to the point where they've got something that's running really well, and what they enjoy is the growth and the challenge. When something's running well and smoothly, they get bored and they go looking for another growth and another challenge.
Mm.
And
Something to put your teeth into. Yeah.
I hadn't even realized that about myself until the other day, and I was talking to someone about when I was in my 20s and I was in a fairly senior management role in a pharmaceutical company, like much too young really to be in that role. And they had sent a mentor out from the UK to sit in my office to make sure that I didn't kill anybody. And he, after we had to do a big restructuring for a number of reasons, and after we'd finished it, I said to him, what should I do now? And he said, you should leave. And I was horrified because they'd spent all this money on career development for me, and I was quite insulted. And I said, why? And he said, because you like taking things apart and putting them back together, and you need to go find a way of doing that, and don't stay here and take this apart again.
In a bigger way, yeah.
And recently that I went, wow, he told me that when I was like 28 or something, and yeah, I'm still doing it quite a few years later.
Yeah. So here we are, maybe 3 years on from losing this $10 million. I'm wondering, what are sort of 3 key lessons that you've taken away on a more personal level from this experience?
Okay, so the first one is probably, now how am I going to word this? I just need to think about this for a moment, is that ego and emotion can be business killers. Mm-hmm. And that's positive emotion or negative emotion, it doesn't matter. But that when we are and there's nothing wrong with doing something that you're passionate about or that sort of thing, this is not about that. But when we're looking at making a decision, one of the questions I think that's worth asking ourselves is, if nobody knew I was doing this, would I still do this? Mm-hmm. And then the flip side of that too is, if this was going to be on the front page of the newspaper that I'd done this, would I still want to do it? So someone gave me a question many years ago, and they said that you should always ask, if I'm writing this, you know, how would I feel about it being on the front page of the newspaper? But I think there's also is this decision something that would stand up to public scrutiny? And sometimes we do it because we want the public scrutiny, because we want people to go, wow, look at you, you're so clever. So yeah, ego and emotion, I think, are risky.
Yes.
I think the next thing that I've learned, and this has been a hard one, it's taken me a while, is that if you try to hide the mistake, you don't learn the lesson. Mm-hmm. That there's a lot of shame around messing up like this. Mm-hmm. And for me, where, you know, I used to do talks, and my talks were about, you can be clever like me, you know. And so when you can't say that anymore, it's really challenging to figure out, well, do I tell people that this went bad? What do I tell them? How do I explain it? Because one of the things that people always want to know is, always don't know, what happened? Like, why did it go wrong? And what I've realized is that it's kind of the wrong question. It's like when you meet someone who's really successful in their business, and a lot of people, if they don't know how to ask a good quality question, will go, what's the product that you're selling? Because they think that they can just sell that product to and they'll have the same success. Whereas in fact, what they should be trying to find out is, how does that person think? You know, what do they do? How do they think? What are their strategies? And it's the same when people want to know, like, what went wrong? What did you do? It's like, that's actually not the question. The question is not which was the specific thing that went wrong. The question is, what was it about your character and your decision making and your processes that caused this? Because that's, I think, where people can learn. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it does.
And then the third one is about identity, which is a really tricky one. Like, one of the things that all these guys who had big failures said to me is, the first thing you've got to do is separate your identity from your business success, which was kind of like saying, the first thing you've got to do is learn to fly without an airplane. It's like, that doesn't even, this sentence doesn't even make sense to me. Like, sure, that would be great. Tell me how. And then they go, oh, no, I can't tell you how. You've just got to do it. And it was so incredibly frustrating to me that they all said this. They all said, oh, my identity was really tied up in my business success, and I wasn't able to be successful again until I was able to let go of that, which is so annoying. And
it's hard to separate the two.
Yeah, and so there was a real lesson for me in that, there's, in terms of going, well, what does that mean? How do you separate that? Interestingly, a lot of the people that I studied had, you know, these were pretty opinionated type A kind of men. Like, I can imagine what the previous version of them would have been like. And they were all saying now, well, what I do is I meditate in the morning, or I surf. Like, they all were doing all these kind of woo things, I guess, which was such a surprise to me. And these were not woo kind of people. And it seemed that they had some correlation between this letting go of this whole identity and ego thing and the, I don't know if you want to call it spiritual practice, that whatever you want to call it, that they were doing something a bit deeper than just counting the dollars. And you know, I don't think I'm 100% there yet in terms of that one, but I do know that there's a lesson in there about identity somehow.
We are evolving every day. So I'm curious then, how many of the people that you've interviewed for your book are actually women, or are they mostly men?
I would love to find some women. They're actually all men, every single one of them, which is really not a very statistically useful sample in that sense. And one of the guys, that's when he said to me, oh, you know, women don't do stupid things. I was like, I'm sure we do. And I think part of the reason is that my criteria initially was, I wanted people who'd lost more than 10 million, but that 10 million had to be a substantial proportion of their net worth. So I wasn't interested in talking to a billionaire who'd lost 10 million. It's like, boo-hoo, too bad for you. That's not, you know. I was looking for people who had a catastrophe, a financial catastrophe. And, you know, maybe, I don't know, I'm still interested to know, is it that women, when they get to that size, do most women not do ridiculous ego-driven things? I'd love to know. So yeah, if you know anybody who's in that category that has done a really big mess up, I'm interested. The other thing I'm thinking is that I'm just going to have to start interviewing people who haven't failed and find out what the difference is.
Well, there you go. That would be another, the flip side, looking at that as well. Yeah. Maybe women are more considered in their decision making.
Yeah, it's curious. I'm interested. I think the other thing that a number of people have said to me too, and that my criteria initially in terms of the whole must be a minimum of 10 million in my mind, and that was once again from, I guess, where my paradigm, where my ego was sitting, was like, well, if you've lost less than 10 million, then, you know, that wouldn't hurt. I know, like, you can hit me, that's fine. But now I'm realizing that if someone lost 100,000 and that was everything they had, or if they lost 5,000 and that was everything they had, that's actually substantial. So my criteria in terms of dollar value, I'm thinking that round 2, I might not have that. I might have it more as a proportion of what was their total net worth and, you know, what did they lose.
So whether it's, you know, $5,000, $100,000 or $10 million, let's say we have a woman who's made a risky decision and the outcome is looking potentially quite wobbly for her. What advice might you give her, given your experience?
I think the biggest thing is to seek wise counsel. So when I was in that situation, I immediately went into, I'm not going to discuss this with anybody. I've got to figure out what to do because it's my mess. I've got to clean it up. So I think Seek Wise Counsel has got two halves to that advice. One is you've got to go and start talking to some other people and get advice. But the other part is it's really critical who you're getting advice from. Because we tend to confide in friends and family in those kind of situations, and they're afraid for us, and they will give us advice based on that. They'll give us advice based on the fact that either they're afraid for us and they love us, or they believe in us and they'll be like, yeah, you'll be fine, you can do this. So I would really encourage people who are in that situation to go, and maybe it's as I'm getting older, but I'm starting to think that it's really hard to get wise counsel from someone who hasn't already been through the fire.
I would agree.
I'm not sure about the 19-year-old life coach crowd, that.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, get the right expertise, get someone who's been there, been through that, walk that path already, so they can give you valuable insight.
And most of the advice that you see kind of advertised is insolvency accountants and people like that. If you start Google business problems or business restructuring or anything like that, you'll find, insolvency accountants, whereas it's not about that actually. It's about someone who can say, well, what's your overall picture? What's your revenue? What are you going to do to increase it? Can you increase it? Is that realistic? Are you dreaming? Do you have the energy? What other resources do you have? What's your team like? All those kind of questions. It's a strategy discussion rather than a financial one, I think.
Definitely. Yeah. So I'm curious, when is your book being published? When are we going to be able to get our little hands on it?
End of January. So I've got to have it to the editor by early December. They're supposed to get their thing done by early January, and then the printer. So yeah, late January.
Oh, I look forward to having a good read of that. We'll revisit that again. I'll certainly have another interview with you closer to that time, so that we can make sure everyone knows about your book launch when it gets closer. So thank you so much for your time today, Mel. It's been super awesome chatting with you.
You're welcome. Thank you.